Welcome back to SDP Talks. My guest today, speaking from Rome, is author, journalist, and political thinker Thomas Fazzi. Welcome, Thomas.
Hello.
Now, a couple of years ago, Thomas wrote this very interesting and informative book, Reclaiming the State, with an Australian economist called Bill Mitchell. An important book, and it chronicles the decline politically and electorally of democratic parties of the left in Europe over the last 30 years. So the first question I'd like to ask you, Thomas, is a broad one. What are the main reasons for the democratic left losing its way?
Well, yes, it is a massive question that requires an equally massive answer, which I won't be able to give. So I'll focus on what is the main aspect that we look at in the book. So there are many reasons for the decline of the political left in the West over the past 30 or so years. But the specific aspect that we look at in the book is the changing view of the left vis-a-vis the nation state and sovereignty more in general. And so we kind of situate the beginning of that shift in kind of the mid to late 1970s. That's when many of the problems of the left, of the Western left, begin. And so what happens then is that basically the kind of post-war Keynesian regime that we had known for the past 30 years or so essentially goes into crisis. And so it's what we have is a situation where the system isn't able to generate economic growth. It's not able to generate it's increasingly unable to generate societal consensus. So there's kind of a breakdown of that regime to a large degree brought on by the oil crises of the 1970s. But I would say that's just what triggered the crisis of a system that in fact had many inherent problems in and of itself. But without focusing too much on reasons for that crisis, I would say from the left standpoint, what happens is that the left kind of believed that kind of the post-war Keynesian consensus was, I would say, kind of was something you could not go back from. And so that was kind of a structural advancement in the managing of modern capitalism. Obviously, from the left standpoint, it was a great, step forward compared to the kind of laissez-faire free market capitalism that had preceded it. And many socialist and labor thinkers kind of theorized that system was just a stepping stone towards greater socialism. And so what the Keynesian regime had put Western countries on was kind of a natural tendency towards greater socialism. And so in many ways, they took that framework for granted as something that you could not lose. And so when, in fact, history proved the left very wrong in this respect, when we saw over the course of quite a short period of time, the Keynesian consensus completely breaking down and this new monetarist and what we now call neoliberal consensus emerging so quickly, a lot of the left was caught off guard. They really didn't have the kind of intellectual tools to understand what was happening because they hadn't thought critically enough about that system. They hadn't realized that system was precisely a consensus between labor, and capital that was made possible by great number of variables that just happened to kind of come together in the post-war period. But that system wasn't destined to last forever. As soon as it became increasingly less beneficial for capital, especially big capital, to support that regime, they withdrew their support for that kind of class compromise. And but the left, it wasn't thinking about the system that way. And so when that whole system fell apart, they really didn't have any way of explaining what was happening, rather than the kind of explanation that their enemy was giving. So the kind of the explanations that we were hearing about the crisis of Keynesianism from the likes of Milton Friedman and others, which explained that crisis in terms of, the structural deficiencies of Keynesianism. And so much of the left really ended up accepting that there was no alternative to the crisis of Keynesianism other than neoliberalism. They really didn't think that there was a real alternative to that.
Yeah, it's very interesting though, if you look at the data or the macroeconomic data of the period, say in Britain, up to the inflection point in 1975, 76, Callaghan's speech and so on, actually the record was not too bad. And the strange thing, when I look at the data now, Thomas, I look at the economic performance since economic liberalism became orthodoxy, and it's really pretty poor. And the thing that strikes me is how they've got away with a narrative of saying that a sort of debt-driven model, which is what we've ended up with, is better in some way. Actually, just on the data, and if you judge the system by unemployment or employment rates, economic growth, and so on, actually the narrative judges the period to 1970s, to the Thatcher era, very harshly, and lets the economic liberal consensus after that off very lightly. Would you think that's a fair appraisal?
Yes. So the historical record of neoliberalism is absolutely appalling. If we, even based on kind of mainstream capitalist standards, if we look at growth rates in the neoliberal era, they're much, much lower than they were in the Keynesian era. And that's not to mention, of course, much more socially oriented variables such as unemployment, poverty, inequality, and so on. And it really is a testament to just the overwhelming, the crushing success of neoliberalism and of neoliberal ideology that today we accept as we take as acceptable things that would have been completely unacceptable in just 30, 40 years ago, especially in the 1970s, when unemployment rates of 4-5% would have been considered fairly high. And today, especially if you look at the Eurozone, we have countries where unemployment rates of 10, 15, 20% have essentially become the norm. And that's a testament to the strength of the TINA. There is no alternative ideology, and it kind of connects to what I was saying earlier. And so when the left accepts that there's no other solution other than neoliberalism to the crisis of Keynesianism, then once you internalize TINA, then you've already given up, because that means that you're going to accept pretty much anything the system throws at you because you don't believe there is an alternative.
That's how we see it on where we are. I think to as much as anything, it was basically a crisis of confidence. And there was a sort of collapse. And if you look at the political history in Britain, when the left, if you can call it the left, in the form of New Labour actually came back in 97, they'd lost all confidence in doing what we would describe as a basic, just the basics. You might want to have a nationalised railway system. You might want to build some, have a state public housing programme and these things. And actually, Tony Blair's government didn't have the confidence to do any of that. So the whole centre of gravity had shifted, and it seemed to be, a complete capitulation to you just can't do this.
Yeah, no, I mean, the idea was that the best the left could hope for was a kind of slightly more humane management of a free market system, what was considered to be, the only possible, form of economic organization. And yes, over the years, the left has essentially totally internalized this idea. And in the book, we focus on how this really profoundly influenced the left's thinking with regard to the nation state. And so throughout most of the 20th and previous centuries, of course, the organizing framework of politics in general, but of course of left thinking as well, was considered to be the nation state. That was considered to be the natural, the only existing perimeter for politics, especially for democratic politics. And so, and in fact, the defense of sovereignty was considered, essential for left parties and movements, and not just in the West. I mean, of course, we have countless examples of left movements in developing countries and third world countries, of course, rallying under the banner of national independence, national sovereignty, national liberation. That's fairly obvious. But even if we look at Western, the West in general, but especially Western Europe, we see that socialist and communist and labor parties attached a great importance to the question of national sovereignty, and for that very reason, we're very, very skeptical about the process of European integration. That what was emerging as the kind of emerging European Union, and that was for a very simple reason, because they understood that democracy could only exist within the confines of the nation state. That beyond that, what you have is just a wild, wild west. Where whoever has the biggest guns wins.
That's right, and we have the same thinking. Basically, we basically believe that there's an upper limit to democracy, and that is the nation state. And the nation state is also the highest level where you can really convene the solidarity and mutuality to share. And I've argued a lot, if you don't understand that, you don't end up with the sharing. I mean, that's what's at stake here. Is if you lose the mutuality, you lose the sharing. It's a major problem. I just wonder, I wanted to put something to you, Thomas. One of the what you might call the neoliberal turn, or we would call the economic liberal turn, that parties of the left got into, also coincided with a cultural turn, didn't it? In some countries it preceded it, and in some countries the cultural turn sort of caught up. But now there's a sort of fairly ugly alliance, isn't there, between a sort of globalist anywhere sort of attitude, and you might call, there's lots of ways of describing it, but you might call progressive ID politics and so on. Do you think, what's the relationship there?
On a kind of very basic level, of course, when one of the consequences of that crisis of the 1970s and the ensuing crisis of the left was, of course, and of course that became, that those problems were further exacerbated by the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, in 1989, where, the only really actually existing alternative to capitalism in the world disappeared, and that really kind of was put the final nail in the 20th century left's coffin, in the sense of having the ability to imagine an alternative. So if once you lose that ability to imagine grand alternatives, so systemic alternatives, then of course the inevitable path is a retreat to the kind of individual level. And so if you can't imagine change at the national level, at the systemic level, at the level of your entire social class, then of course what you start to look for new forms of liberation that become increasingly narrower and narrower, and they end up essentially narrowing down to the single individual. And so if you can't aim for big systemic change, then maybe you can aim for individual liberation, which means that whatever my desires are, whatever my identity is, whatever I feel like being and doing, I have to have the right to do and be. And so it was a slow process, but that's essentially where we've arrived to, where we have this essentially sum of micro identitarian struggles that really never end, because you can break it down further and further. You can make someone's aspirations narrower and narrower and narrower, but ultimately it has to do with individualism. And so once you lose, a class, once you don't have class as your kind of organizing framework anymore, then you naturally end up adopting a kind of individualist approach, which in fact, unites pretty much the entire political spectrum now, especially the left, and I would say especially the so-called radical left, which is one of the paradoxes of our age.
Yeah, I think that's a fair appraisal. I just see it as a sort of overreach of liberalism. If liberalism is about me, then what they've forgotten is about us. And so certainly the broader economic ideas or aims that you might have on the left, full employment or reducing inequality. I mean, what's astonishing about the posturing among some of the woke progressive groups are their indifference to inequality. I mean, inequality has been taken off the agenda somewhat and displaced by minority grievances, which is a pity. And actually, as a political program, I think the problem for parts of the left there is that the left at its best is about convening solidarity that everyone can buy into, and actually all this divisive stuff is doing the opposite. Would you agree?
Yeah, and it's it's a complete dead end for the left to take up these issues, because these are issues that capital has no problem taking up itself. And so what you think you're fighting a very radical battle, but in fact it's a battle that's completely compatible, with the maintenance of the status quo in economic and social terms. And in fact, we constantly see it. We see how the parties that represent big capital are more than happy to integrate these struggles into their own agenda, because it doesn't shift the balance of power a single inch. And so for the left to to really throw itself head down into these issues has been complete suicide.
It's very interesting because it has been a distraction, and it, the idea as long as you've got the right attitudes, then it doesn't really matter. As I say, inequality doesn't matter, and hoarding vast amounts of money in corporations or whatever doesn't matter. So yeah, it's been a distraction. In terms of you mentioned the Soviet Union there. Of course, our aims as Social Democrats in the UK were pretty modest. I mean, it wasn't. For us, it isn't. We would always argue we weren't really asking for very much. We take a very frontier and domain type view of our social market approach, which is that we only wanted the state to do what was within its domain. And I think the problem is that the market there's so much outsourcing, the collapse in confidence in what the state can do in the UK anyway, has meant that the very basics that you'd want to be part of your state, part of the social market, is being taken away basically, and you've got the market encroaching onto the state's domain. That's the way we looked at it. I want to move on to how we view the nation state in the world, because I think another aspect of the left's difficulties has been how it's failed completely to accommodate its core working class voters and families with coming to terms with globalization and the pressures that globalization's put on people. And we basically have an aim to try and seek a sort of softer, what we call a softer globalism, if it's a globalism, where people can make their own social and economic bargains domestically, and their politicians can put them into action. So how would you share our aim of a sort of softer globalism, where the state, people can make their own bargains and their democratic politicians can try and implement them?
Well, I don't know if I'd call it soft globalism. I certainly agree with the idea that nation states have to be re-empowered politically, and I definitely subscribe to the notion that that's what much of the book is about. Nation states have been deliberately weakened. This idea that we had to give into globalization, we had to give into globalism because nation states were becoming obsolete, were increasingly powerless in this world where capital was increasingly borderless, and where private financial capital was becoming increasingly powerful. In fact, as we show in the book, there was nothing inevitable about all that. I mean, that was just a political decision, and even the weakening of nation states was part of this. Was an integral part of this process of globalization, which was entirely a political project, and the idea was that economic decisions had to be raised at a higher level where essentially electorates, voting masses wouldn't be able to reach the levers of economic and, of course, political decision making, and global, and well, what we call globalism was essentially that. People sometimes, mistake globalism for internationalism, and they say, oh, but of course, you need forms of international collaboration. Of course, but globalism is the opposite of that. It's the opposite of international collaboration. As the name says, international collaboration presupposes the existence of nation states, as free and sovereign as possible, collaborating with each other to reach common goals. And of course, I think, we are all in favor of that. But globalism is an entirely different thing. It's not a variation of it on internationalism. It really is a negation of internationalism, because it's about disempowering the nation state, disempowering democracy, and creating a kind of governance structure that exists above and beyond nation states.
In particular, above the ability of the demos or the voting public to gain access to it. And that's the critical thing. And you call it, I think, in the book, a process of depoliticization. We've called it in the past a process of deciding everything pre-politically, so everything's decided and taken off the table. And of course, that results in ordinary citizens feeling powerless. That's the end result of that process. If you say, well, what does it matter? My politicians don't have power over these things. The curious thing, I want to ask you a question about this. What do you think explains the appetite for supposedly democratic politicians throughout Europe to accept a level of control above their heads on these things? Is it that they're just giving up responsibility, or what is it? Why have they been so keen on this?
Well, I think there are various reasons for that, and I think the reasons to a certain degree differ from country to country. But in some countries, definitely the countries of Southern Europe, so the ones I know best, including my country, Italy, there was this idea that essentially the masses had become ungovernable. And so you had too much social conflict, which was considered to be the result of too much democracy, of people placing too many demands on government. And there was a fear that would have led down the road of course, increased socialization of the economy, more a widening of social rights, and basically with the working classes gaining more and more power. And that wasn't it was not an entirely unfair assessment, in my opinion. And so the question was, okay, how do we break this cycle from the perspective of the kind of ruling elites? And in countries like mine, they saw basically, they saw the idea of an external constraint as the solution to that problem. And so they said, okay, there's no way we can, we can't, unless we go down the kind of road of a military junta, which some countries did, if we look at Greece and Spain. But in countries that accepted the kind of formally bourgeois democratic framework, there was this idea of, okay, how do we impose these reforms that we consider to be necessary, but that we're never going to be able to push through democratically because there's no consensus for them. And they came up with this idea of the external constraint, or vincolo esterno in Italian. And the idea was, okay, if we cede some sovereignty to a higher institution, then we can displace the responsibility for whatever bad choices we're going to have to make on these external authorities, and that way people won't really have anyone to bring their grievances to, because these are going to be institutions that are placed well beyond the confines of the nation state, in faraway cities, if not other countries. And so in a way, politicians accepted to formally weaken their power, but in fact, by doing so, they became stronger, because now they could say, it's not up to me. Look, I would be happy to take, to do your interests, but unfortunately, Europe is demanding that we do this. Or if we look at the European monetary system of the 1980s and early 90s, so the kind of system of fixed exchange rates, suddenly you had something that you could basically blame the responsibility for all the tough social choices that governments had to do. So they could say, okay, we're very sorry, but this is necessary to stay within this system to keep, to keep the exchange rate stable or whatever. And of course, the euro ended up being the ultimate external constraint, where you're essentially giving up what is the kind of, I would say, the defining pillar of democracy and national sovereignty, which is the issuance of the currency. Once you give that up, you essentially become a colony to whoever controls the currency, as the great British economist Wynne Godley wrote in the early 1990s, when even the UK was, considering whether to join the euro or not, and for its own sake, it didn't. And so yes, so it's important to understand that the process of European integration wasn't just, something that was imposed upon nation states and upon, populaces by evil supranational institutions. In fact, in many cases, it was the national elites themselves that were more than happy to create this kind of system of supranational governance, because they saw it as a way of gaining more power themselves, and and that they thought that system would help them implement policies that they wanted to implement anyway, but wouldn't have been able to do so through the normal channels of democracy. And so that's kind of, I would say, what happened, at least in a number of countries.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think they, certainly in Portugal, it was interweaved with just the grand European project and membership of the European Union anyway. Certainly for a long time, Europa insisted we must do this, there is no choice, became a phrase, and actually largely the Portuguese public accept it because it was interwoven part of the bigger project. But it's still initially at first sight always seems slightly counterintuitive and paradoxical that national politicians would give power away. But as what you're saying, basically, like you said in the book about the choice to make the economic liberal turn anyway, what you're saying is that these domestic politicians wanted to implement a certain policy mix, and they got it via Brussels. So.
Sure, and I think the UK is a good example too on the whole Brexit debate. Why was so much of the British establishment against Brexit? Because they were more than happy to, the kind of system that the EU, in a way sustained and justified, was, is a system that's entirely in the interest of the major players of British capitalism. And so it's totally understandable why they would prefer to remain inside that system where people aren't given a choice about other possible options, other possible ways of organizing society and the economy, because this is these are rules of this, of the great European family that we belong to. And we've been hearing that kind of narrative from a number of British politicians as well. And I think that really explains a lot of the Brexit debate.
It does a lot of the heavy lifting. Certainly, they can achieve their aims. The EU does that for them. Although I thought you remember, obviously you'll be aware, in Britain the 17+ million people voted to leave, but certainly around 5 million people on the left voted to leave, and we concentrated on what we call the Lexit case. And in debating, certainly our aims post-Brexit were really very different to many of the economic liberals that were on our side on Brexit. And I made the point to them several times that, in fact, a lot of those people said, well, we want to be free to do our own thing. Well, actually, the international free trade system that they aspire to would put basically a lot of rules beyond their grasp as well. So you're not really getting sovereignty. You talk in the book about relocalization, don't you? Trying to sort of ground and base democracy back into nation states. Do you think that some trade friction is necessary for that?
Oh, absolutely. I think, in very basic terms, I think there's a very strong environmental argument to be made for relocalization and for downsizing, the amount of the volume of international trade. The system we have in place today is just pure madness. Anyone can just pick up any food product in a supermarket and see that how a simple piece of meat could have gone all around Europe, if not all around the world, before landing in that supermarket. And the same goes for so many other products. So I think there's first of all an environmental case to be made for putting an end to this absolute madness. We know that international trade is a huge contributor to CO2 emissions, and so I think first and foremost, there's a very strong case to be made for this, for the notion that whatever can be produced nationally should be produced nationally. And I think the strongest case for that is first and foremost an environmental case.
Yeah, I mean, we agree. I mean, and that actually is classic Keynesianism from the 30s, where if something can be produced locally, it really ought to be. Makes sense, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense from of course, from a working class labor perspective, because it creates, good jobs in the national economy. But it's not just that. It's also a question of we hear a lot of talk about resilience nowadays. Well, if you want to make an economy more resilient, then reduce its dependence on other nations for basic items that the national economy needs to get along. And I think the dangers and the pitfalls of hyperglobalization were really exposed by the global pandemic, where we saw just how crazy it is to have these incredibly thinly stretched supply chains that go all around the world just to get a single item on your table, because all it takes is for a single chain, a single link in that chain to come undone, for the whole chain to come apart. And we saw that, when China was forced to close down many of its factories in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw entire supply chains collapse basically overnight. And so I think there's an increasing awareness, even among Western politicians, that this was kind of madness. You've created a system that they've been telling us for years makes us stronger, it makes us richer. That's not true at all. We created a system that makes us incredibly fragile and incredibly exposed to the kind of the smallest, black swan.
We well, in a sense, it wasn't a black swan in the Taleb sense, was it? Because we know we're going to get global viral pandemics, and it would have happened at some stage. I totally agree with you. I think what it exposed is a class of politicians over the last 30 years that have been completely indifferent to what is made where and by whom, and they wonder, having gutted the factories in the States, that people turn to populism. Well, there's a little link there, really. If you have policies which are against the core interests of your previously core vote, you're going to pay for it, and people will look somewhere else to go. I wonder if we could turn finally to Italy, because it's a good opportunity for our viewers to get a little bit of an insight. Now, obviously, we're keen on European states. We need to reindustrialize. I think there's been far too much indifference to deindustrialization. And Italy, certainly in the period since it's been in the euro, its economic performance has not been good. You're basically trapped in low growth, high unemployment, and an increasing deindustrialization. So I'd like to ask you, what reasonable options does Italy have? And I think probably countries like Portugal, who are trapped in this situation going forward, what are the options to improve things?
Well, yes, I think Italy is a sort of a textbook example of just how bad it can be to give up your monetary sovereignty, and just how disastrous the consequences of doing that can be. You've got a country that essentially pulled itself up, from its knees after a disastrous world war in the 1950s, and with its own resources, with its own currency, importantly, essentially went from a war-ravaged nation to being the fourth or fifth, depending on how you look at it, economy in the world by the 1980s. And then that same economy, so same people, same resources, same ingenuity, and so on, over the course of just 20 years, was essentially turned into an economic basket case. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate the case. I mean, Italy is very resilient again. So despite the very negative effects that the euro has had, we're still 10th or 11th economy in the world. But I think that the euro really shows just how much damage you can do to a country by forcing it to adopt a kind of monetary and economic straitjacket that doesn't suit its own economy. And so yes, I mean, the consequences, I mean, and to go back to what I was saying earlier, the euro was really, I mean, the Maastricht framework more in general, and then the euro was really used to, I would say, radically overhaul the Italian economy in the early 90s. As I said earlier, there was this perception that Italy's economy was just out of sync with most Western economies, in the sense that it had what was considered to be too large a public sector. It had a massive public industry. Pretty much the entire banking system was publicly held, and so there was this idea, especially in kind of neoliberal circles, that Italy was kind of this quasi-socialist nation, at a time when every other Western country was embracing neoliberalism, and there was this idea that how are we going to impose neoliberalism in Italy? And as I said earlier, Maastricht was the way they sought to do that, and in effect did do that. And part of that was using Maastricht was using Europe as a justification for pretty much dismantling the entire public public industry system that we had.
The thing that puzzles me is that, I mean, the states in the south certainly have had their capacities removed. Basically, that's the awkward thing. So you're, fully integrated member states. The political class doesn't have their hands on the policy levers to defend their industry or defend their interests. So the form of adjustment that an external currency like the lira would have is, for industrial producers in the north, is that you can adjust and reprice. I know it irritated quite a lot of German manufacturers, but I look at I'm going to give you a metaphor which I think applies to the single market in the Eurozone, which is a boxing ring. It's one I've used several times. And you've got a heavyweight industrial producer in Germany and its connected supply countries next to it in its industrial structure, and you've got people on the periphery who aren't heavyweights. And every single year, exposure to this heavyweight without any means to defend yourself, your industry gets knocked out. And certainly studying Portugal, pretty much relentlessly deindustrialization every single year.
These countries are facing a very bleak future. I mean, I think Italy really it continues to be the euro's weak link, not in a sense that it's a weak country, but in a sense that it's the only country that would still have really everything to gain from leaving the euro, and it's a country that would still have the chance to. I mean, it still has an industrial base. It's a declining. It's an industrial base that's getting smaller and smaller, but it still has an industrial base that's big and strong enough. And of course, that could be quite rapidly rebuilt in a kind of post-Euro scenario where we regain those levers of economic policy, where it could become, strong enough to really get back on its feet quite rapidly, and in doing so, prove, be an example to other countries that might want to go down that way. But of course, for countries like Spain and Portugal, which have really, whose industries have been really completely decimated and have really, increasingly transformed themselves into kind of, massive tourist attractions for rich tourists from Central and Northern Europe. It's of course much harder, but at the same time, There's no way they're going to regain a degree of industrial autonomy if they don't regain, the levers of economic policy. I mean, that's pretty clear. But again, I mean, if you look at what's astonishing is that if you look at countries like Spain and Greece, support for the euro is still, and for the European Union more in general, is still fairly strong, especially among the left, which is another one of those paradoxes, which harks back to what we were saying earlier.
It is a paradox. It's a complete paradox because the fully integrated position in the EU effectively bans you from implementing the Keynesianism which a lot of the left profess to want to implement. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous. I mean, the extent of Euroscepticism is interesting because I mean, in some countries, Holland and Germany, it doesn't exist. I mean, it really doesn't exist.
Why would it?
Why would it? Yeah, exactly. I don't know. I mean, broadly, one of the interesting things looking at it from the UK in the Italian situation has just been the extent of the power over the member state that the elite at the centre has. I mean, we had after Berlusconi, you had Mario Monti imposed as a technocrat. And then you had this, and I don't know if you'll agree with my reading, but then you had a reaction against that, and you have, a coalition between two parties that weren't really together. I guess Lega and Five Star, and then that fell apart, and now you're back to having imposed yet another technocrat, Mario Draghi. I mean, can you just outline how that happens? How is that allowed to happen?
Well, that really goes to show that the Eurozone really is a kind of it can be likened to a kind of neo-colonial system where the center has a complete stronghold over the countries of the periphery. I would, to the extent that I would call into question the idea that Italy can still be considered a democracy, even in the kind of bourgeois understanding of the term, to the extent that now we have this supranational institution in the form of the European Union, and more specifically the ECB, which essentially has the power to financially strangle a government or a country that steps out of line. We saw that in Greece in 2015, where the ECB went as far as shutting down the Greek banking system just to put pressure on the Greek government. The left-leaning Greek government that at the time was, right in the midst of very heated negotiations with the European Commission about, finding possible alternatives to austerity. And at that very moment, what does the ECB do? It basically forces the entire Greek banking system to shut down. Completely unprecedented event in history, as far as I know, a central bank shutting down its own country's banking system, to the extent that the ECB is also Greece's central bank. But we also saw it in Italy in 2011, when again, in the midst of a government crisis, as you mentioned, Berlusconi was in power at the time, the European Central Bank thought very well to essentially stop buying Italian bonds on sovereign bond markets, with the explicit aim, as Mario Monti himself admitted later on, of sending interest rates through the roof and precipitating a government crisis in Italy, as a way of ushering in then a technocrat such as Monti that would implement precisely the kind of policies that the ECB was demanding from the Berlusconi government. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that we're dealing with an extremely pernicious regime. I mean, so I think the euro should be seen not just as an extremely dysfunctional economic model, but also, and perhaps especially, a political regime, a form of very authoritarian political governance. So this is, I think, this is very important, and what we've seen over the past 10 years in Italy, which you were referring to, really shows that we're at a point where, regardless of who comes to power, whoever manages to form a government in Italy nowadays is essentially deprived of all the economic levers that would be necessary to get the country out of the crisis that it's in, especially now, that we've lost, almost 15% of GDP due to COVID.
It's shocking. I mean, certainly looking at it from our side, it's been shocking. I mean, you'll be aware of the pressure that was put on Brexit as a political project, and they tried their very, very best. I mean, our elites, many of our cultural, political, business elites over here, desperate that it didn't happen, and now desperate that it fails. So it's very difficult. But I mean, to your point about what happened in Greece, I mean, Bill Mitchell made the point a few times that there isn't any mutuality. I mean, where it shows the project is completely at the core. It doesn't exist. I mean, when the Greek crisis came, it was the French and German banks that were bailed out, and the people in Greece were thrown away. I mean, what I think is it shows something in the human condition. If you can sell these things on the basis of a sort of utopian project, people seem to just forget about the detail. But 40 or 50% youth unemployment in the South is not a detail. It's outrageous.
But it really goes to show that how much people can withstand and are willing to tolerate if they don't believe if they really think that that's almost God's decision, because that's what neoliberal tells them. This is basically you're living in the best of possible world, in the best of all possible worlds, and it might not be great, but it's the best you can hope for here on earth. You can try and hope for something better in the afterlife, and of course, once you accept that idea, which the left completely accepted, then almost anything becomes possible in terms of social experimentation, and I think we're seeing that. Italy is, we see at regular intervals a pushback, but at the bottom line is that until that pushback becomes a pushback against the European Union and against the euro, and becomes a movement for greater national sovereignty, then Italy is just gonna, these so-called populist uprisings are just gonna be constantly diffused, because they're gonna, they're not addressing what is the root problem of Italy, which is the euro.
It is the root problem. I'm not sure in the end. I mean, I know that what you call the extreme centre has been quite successful actually in deflecting these revolutions, basically. But I'm not sure that they will succeed in the long run, because oppositions have a habit in the end of becoming governments, and I think somewhere in Europe that's going to happen. It may not be a sort of type of populism that we would approve of, but I think they're on fairly thin ice. So anyway, we'll see. Can I thank you very much and wish you all the best. The book, just to remind people, is Reclaiming the State, which is an interesting read. Thank you very much for your time, Thomas Fazzi. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.